Well, a pleasant afternoon to you wherever you happen to be. I am Michael Hinkson, your host, and you are listening to Unstoppable Mindset. Now, we get to interview lots of different people who do lots of different things, which really makes it fun. We get to inspire. And I frankly will tell you, I love being inspired. We get to talk with Sherry Johnson today, who has a company called Cultivating Strategy, and we'll get to that. But a little known fact, except for a close circle around Sherry, she had a birthday yesterday. So Sherry, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset and happy birthday.
Thank you so much.
We won't give away your age. That's entirely up to you. But I want to tell you, we're really glad you're here. I enjoyed chatting with you and preparing for this. So let's start by telling you or asking you to tell us a little bit about your roots, where you came from growing up, what it was like, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, thanks. Happy to be here and so lucky to get to do this. So I came from southern Wisconsin, a Rust Belt town called Janesville, Wisconsin. And my town really was embodied a lot of what shaped me, deep divisions. We produced Janesville, both Russ Feingold and Paul Ryan, two completely opposite politicians, if you know them.
Yes, I would say.
Yeah, right. And even my own household was a fractal image of that. My mother was a union steward in a factory. My dad retired for sergeant first class in the Army. And they used to joke how they canceled out one another's votes all the time. So really grew up in a lot of tension and also a lot of, they both lost their jobs during the mid-'80s, as so many did. And that Rust Belt town got a lot rustier. And that kind of sense of loss and some of the family traumas that compounded around that and my family's background shaped a lot of how I approach my work and who I've become and how I relate to those roots all the time. And I think too, this will come up later, but I think too, my family was also impacted not just from, caste and job loss, but also generational trauma that may have actually come from being neurodivergent in a world in which that's not really created for us to be successful, right?
So
yeah.
Where did the neurodivergence come in?
Well, it's genetic. A lot of that. I actually had a midlife autism diagnosis. And when I looked back and kind of, the crash that I had at that time, I look back at a lot of the family trauma that I experienced and started seeing these signs of OCD, ADHD, autism in my family of origin, and how a lot of that sort of set up some difficulties and how we were able to approach life, view life, get along with others, collaborate or not. And it really isolated us in our town. So
do you think, or do you know, were there other people in your family who had neurodivergent kinds of things, or are you the one?
Oh, no.
The chosen one?
My dad was very likely OCD, autistic, possibly ADHD as well. My mother was most definitely autistic and really struggled with some depressive issues midlife because of that. I believe my grandfather was. I think there were lots of folks on my father's side as well. And so just kind of growing up around that and not really being able to trace back some roots about why is my family so different? What is it about us not being able to fit in and really find our places in society? Why are we so sort of why do we continue to isolate ourselves? And I feel like I have a lot more answers about that now.
So how old were you when you were diagnosed?
I was actually, so I live here in St. Paul, Minnesota now, but for a while my spouse's job moved and we had to move out to Seattle for a handful of years. And having been sort of taken out of my context and my community that I had built up in my mid-30s, I had a breakdown. There were days where I was laying on the couch with a blanket over my head, and I literally could not get up. And I know that my story is not unique. I had to start over, and I didn't know how. And it felt very much like a lot of, you sort of go through this year or so of reinterpreting your entire life and why you made certain decisions or not, and what it felt like. And again, your family of origin and all of that. And I took all of that and sort of had to rebuild who I was and how I saw myself as a disabled person in a world that was not necessarily designed for me to be successful. Right.
So when did you get diagnosed?
That was 30, I want to say 38.
I've talked to a number of people on this podcast who got diagnosed with autism or other disabilities in their 30s, right, and into their 40s. I know several people who were diagnosed with autism and ADHD in their 30s. Uh-huh. I know one person who we talked with who knew that they didn't see well, but never really got a diagnosis until a little bit later.
Wow.
How was it for you when you got a diagnosis and really understood what was going on?
Well, I went through that year of just kind of reinterpreting my entire life. There was a lot of anger. I remember feeling for a long time that the whole world was hiding something from me. Like there were all these implicit rules that I wasn't in on, all these shortcuts to emotions. And
they didn't send you the memo.
Right. Like it was an entire life of feeling like I missed the memo. And by the way, this is part of my executive dysfunction is numbers. It was actually my early 40s that I was diagnosed. And I remember just feeling that profound sense of grief, of lost time, of not understanding myself, of not understanding that there are people like me, that there have been always people like me. You go through this, you read a lot of books and you start seeing yourself represented. We talk about representation in mass media all the time. And I'm so excited to be able to see myself. And that's what helped me kind of redefine myself from an outsider, feeling like an outsider all my life, to an outlier, someone who has something different to give. And so I started creating a field with the ways that I was approaching training and consulting and facilitation and coaching, and allowing my neurology to kind of shape something new.
And really, I'm not even sure I would go so far as to say outlier, because what it allowed you to do was to realize who you were, which allowed you to then move forward and become a real part of and feeling like a real part of society.
Yeah. I mean, I always feel like I'm the sauciest one who kind of sees things a little bit differently and kind of is a lot really intense for a lot of people.
It is.
I'm proud of that difference. And at the same time, it's helped me appreciate even more others' differences and to try to help people collaborate in ways where we can honor those differences, lift them up, celebrate how those differences are really where innovation comes from. Those differences are how we move forward in new ways and in healthier ways, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go back. So when you were growing up, you went to regular public schools and all that kind of thing, I assume?
Yeah. We were, I should say, there was these gifted programs that they were experimenting with back in the 80s. And almost every 201 of us were neurodivergent in some sense. And so we had our own different social milieu, some of which was damaging, some of which was healthy. But we were kept together, separated and kept together from about 4th grade to about 8th grade, and then just sort of thrown out of that program in 9th grade. And so that even added, I think, to this sense of isolation and difference and outliership or outsidership at the time.
Yeah.
You're just like, whoa, what just happened? And then suddenly you're in all these classes where you're breaking the curve and upsetting upper class people because you're the freshman in chemistry getting the A+, right? And you feel ostracized. You don't make a lot of friends, let me tell you.
Yeah, it is tough. When I was in high school, I actually was taken out of our freshman general science course for the last quarter of the year because my general science teacher said, you seem pretty bored. And I said, yeah, this is all pretty straightforward stuff. And they put me in the senior physics class.
Oh, so you had this experience.
I had that experience too. And as a blind person, I know I wasn't in most of the social groups, the social cliques and so on. Wow. And I was, no one was mean. It just was that I didn't end up associating with people a lot directly. I've talked to some of my high school colleagues a whole lot more after graduation and over the past several years than in high school. But yeah, I know exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, I believe it.
And at some point, you really have to decide you can only do what you can do and you don't have control over how people feel.
Yes. And I think, speaking of how people feel, I think one of the things that's really shaped me post-diagnosis is I got deep, deep, deep into understanding how we construct emotions. I'm a huge fan of this neuroscientist, affective neuroscientist named Lisa Feldman Barrett, who talks about the theory of constructed emotion and the predictive brain model and how that impacts us and impacts our relationships, and thinking about that through an autistic lens. And I've really brought a lot of that affective neuroscience work into my work. And it's helped me also kind of reinterpret my past and see why human difference is so hard for a lot of us to address in a constructive way. But once you understand it, you can kind of start piecing together some experiments to help us connect better across different.
Well, this whole concept of diversity, which everyone seems to embrace, unfortunately, when you deal with it in terms of the traditional ways today, for many of us, it never seems to affect us. For example, diversity doesn't seem to include disabilities today. Yes. Oh, we're a diverse society. We are diverse all the way around. We deal with race and gender and sexual orientation and culture and so on. But you never hear mentions about disabilities. And what's really unfortunate.
You got it.
Yeah, they're trying to get us. What's really unfortunate is that when we talk about these differences and diversity, in reality, we are leaving so many people out, which is why I like the term inclusion a lot more than diversity. Because if you're really going to take inclusion literally, you can't say, well, we are partially inclusive. No, it doesn't work that way. You either are or you're not. You can't leave people out.
Absolutely. I had the pleasure of working with the Minnesota Council on Disability lately, and they taught me so much about, I thought I was doing a pretty good job of making my documentation accessible. No, not until I worked with them did I see all these different ways that what I thought was inclusive wasn't there. It wasn't to their standard, and they really taught me a lot. And so adding that lens to, being neurodivergent as well, and having an idea about lots of different neurotypes and how to be inclusive of that. And of course, I've also done other diversity, equity, inclusion work around anti-racism, and gender inclusion. And I think all of that work, has a lot more commonality than difference. I think a lot of what makes something universally accessible is also what makes something a place fully inclusive of all those things.
Yeah. We need to we need to recognize that there's nothing wrong with being different than everyone else around us. It doesn't make us less or doesn't make us more, which is the unfortunate part about the term disabilities, because people just interpret that as, well, you're not able. Well, that's why what we really need to do, because I haven't come up with a better word, we need to change the definition of disability.
Right. Yeah. And whenever I talk about myself being disabled, I try to talk about disabled in a context. Disabled because something was not designed for me, and there are barriers to it being designed for me to access it. Just the rhythms of everyday life. Honestly, a lot of the organizations I work with right now, for example, we know that there's been this great resignation and this passive quitting because we're all sort of overtaxed and traumatized by the last few years. Well, that's how I felt most of my life. So I feel like I can kind of bring some of that feeling and some of those adaptations that I've made for myself, and listening to my body and in celebrating my values and in being more mindful. I can bring that to groups and help them, even folks who have never experienced any kind of quote unquote disability, feel like there are steps that they can take to succeed more, to be plugged in more, to collaborate better in healthier ways that is honoring to themselves, their bodies, their communities, one another.
There's an interesting book written by Henry Mayer entitled All on Fire, and it's the story of the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison from the 1840s. And one of the things that Mayer talks about in the book is a time when Garrison was looking for more people to join the movement, and he suggested to his people that they contact two ladies, they were sisters, the Grimke sisters. And these sisters were very active suffragettes. And what happened was that his people said, well, we shouldn't contact them. They're not relevant to what we're doing. They're dealing with something totally different than what we're dealing with, and that would just detract. And Garrison said something which I think is extremely profound. He said, it's all the same thing. And how true it is. The reality is we're all fighting to become part of the same society. It doesn't matter whether it's suffrage, doesn't matter whether it's abolition of slavery, doesn't matter whether it's dealing with any kind of disability or whatever. It really is all the same thing. And we need to recognize that and include everyone to deal with the issue.
Absolutely. And also celebrate and lift up and represent those differences in nonfiction and fiction media, right? Like I said, starting to see myself represented was really important to me. And I know that that's been really important to many other colleagues from different backgrounds, for sure.
Well, so what did you do after high school?
I became a high school English and theater teacher because that was the role model that I had from the cast I was from, right? As a first generation college student, the whole concept of going to grad school, even though I really wanted to be a medical doctor or something like that, I just couldn't understand the concept.
You went to college.
I did go to college. I was very lucky to get a full ride scholarship at UW-Madison, and I studied education and theater, taught theater and English to high schoolers for about 10 years, and then transitioned into, I had my kid. And my teenager, they're now 15, was also autistic because, again, we're genetic. And that was really tough as an autistic person who didn't know it yet, having had this autistic person with other high needs and not really having a lot of space or help around that. And so I made some choices, right? I got into community organizing. I taught yoga for a while. I got into my body. I started working on my own emotional landscape and mindfulness. started doing community organizing, which brought me into consensus processes and collaboration. And that's where I became a technology participation certified facilitator. I still train that on a regular basis. And then I just started, it kind of led me from there. Now I do strategic planning for nonprofits. I work with local governments to improve their systems. And it's all just sort of taken off where this last, 10, 15 years. It's kind of put me in a completely different spot. But then I've always been a bit of a polymath. I think that might come from some ADD tendencies as well in my brain. But I think that all of that, kind of like what you were just saying from the quote from the book, is like all is everything. And if you can have your hands in a lot of different things, you can bring a sense of wildlife and plant ecology into changing human systems, right? And it can make that process more meaningful and adaptable. So it's stuff like that I live for, that kind of synthesis.
You said something several times, and we're not going to get political or anything, but I hear a number of people say, oh, my child's autistic because they had vaccinations and so on, and they don't even look at the whole genetic thing. What do you think about all that?
It is 100% genetic.
Yeah.
And I think that we're going to find that we've always had autistic people with us. We've always had ADD people with us. And I think, and I know, all the studies are that vaccines have nothing to do with creating or enabling or turning on any genes when it comes to autism, vaccines. Yeah. And I think for us in the community, the autistic community, it's kind of maddening to hear that come up again, because it was essentially a faked study that even started that whole thing. And now that gentleman makes a lot of money selling that story to different organizations and traveling the world and writing books. And it's really unfortunate how much damage he's done.
Well, so how long ago did you form Creative Strategy?
Cultivate Strategy, yeah.
Cultivate Strategy.
Yeah.
It's another C word. Cultivate Strategy.
All right. And of course, cultivation comes from the ecology bit. But I started my own business before I even left for Seattle about 10, 12 years ago. But it wasn't until I came back from Seattle about 4 years ago that I built Cultivate Strategy out of kind of an amalgamation of all these things that I'd learned. And, it's my third business, and was happy to build it in the state of Minnesota. And I just felt like there was this niche I needed to fill. And I've grown to think of myself more and more as a complexity coach, both for individuals and organizations, to help us think about just to sort out the different complexities. And when we can't make predictable decisions, when things are unordered, what do we do? How do we approach those decisions in ways that we haven't in the past? And that's changed the way that I've approached strategic planning. It's changed the way that I've approached leadership, orientation, and things like that.
Well, tell me a little bit more about your approach and what you do, if you would, please.
Sure. So I come from this place where, it's kind of taken me a long time to kind of define this, because I was always about helping people collaborate across difference. Well, what is that about? That can be about almost anything. But I think where I'm finding my niche is helping people understand when a linear plan, a time-based linear plan with goals, is not always the right frame. It's not always the right way to go. Increasingly, we know that the less predictable our world is, the less predictable the context of an organization, the more experimental we have to be, the more we have to allow things to emerge between humans and within human networks that can be sustainable. It's through changing a system through relatively simple interactions, is what one of my favorite thinkers, Adrienne Marie Brown, talks about, in this changing complex adaptive systems. And thinking about ourselves more as part of nature than something that's imposing order upon nature. And that's what excites me and gets me out of bed every day. So I have a leadership course coming up, for example. It's based on leadership orientations and figuring out what situations you're most gifted to lead in, and when you should really be stepping back and recognizing the leadership orientation of others who are more able to move in that particular context, which is, again, about celebrating difference. And something that has always bugged me is about just moving and operating in a neurotypical world, is that oftentimes those things that I've been teased about throughout my life was overthinking. You're anxious, you're trying too hard. Those things have been a gift to me. That's how my brain works, and it's how I do what I do. And yes, I burn hot, I'm intense, but a lot of that is what allows me to lead in a different way, and more effectively in some contexts. And that's what I'm trying to bring into the organizations I work with too.
One of the things that I have found about leadership and being part of a team is the best team leaders are the ones who also know, to use your words, how to step back and let someone else take the lead to do a particular thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And go ahead.
Because they don't necessarily themselves have all the gifts, or they know who might be better gifted to do a particular thing.
Absolutely. And we all know that, information doesn't flow through human systems unless we trust and care about one another. That's where information hoarding happens in systems where care and trust are missing or deficient. And we know, too, that as our organizations become more and more complex, information is everything. Sharing information is everything. So how do we meet this moment and figure out how to care for ourselves and one another, even as we're working on these harder and harder problems?
Yeah, and it isn't just information. It is absolutely sharing information.
That's gnarly.
We grow up in a world today where trust is so much under attack, which is what's so unfortunate to me. Yeah. Because in reality, we trust in so many ways, and we should be more open to trust than we tend to be.
Yeah. In fact, I had one of the most beautiful situations I've been in the last few years is the day after Donald Trump was elected in 2016. I remembered it was one of the most divisive. It was the Sunday after, rather. One of the most divisive times I can think of, even more so than now, just this sort of everybody holding their breath. And I was hosting a conversation at my suburban Seattle church on gun control. Can you imagine?
There you go.
And we had we had all kinds of people in that room. There were probably 25, 30 people in that room. And we had a very heated, very intense, high conflict, but caring, because we were all part of the same community, caring conversation that I was able to facilitate within some good, boundaries. And that was one of the most effective situations I've been in, because we realized, I think, in that moment that we needed to find a way to care about each other. We needed to leverage our care to have a conversation together about something that is just so high conflict, right? And that gave me a lot of hope for even where we are now, and how we can move forward with the right good boundaries around conversation and collaboration. And I want more of that.
So what was the main bone of contention or the main conflict? Since you all came from a church environment, you were all there, and as you point out, people really cared. What was the main issue that was hard to address or deal with?
It just, there were, again, suburban, mainline, Methodist church. About half of the folks in the room were very pro Second Amendment NRA members. And about half of the room were very sort of liberal moms demand action types of folks who were very, very frustrated with the state of gun legislation in the country. And, even in that context, those tensions exist. And in fact, I think churches, mainline churches particularly, are one of the last places where you can find that level of difference, even in a caring community. And those differences, by the way, often are under the rug. We don't talk about them.
Yeah.
We pretend everything is okay until we can't.
Well, was there any room to discuss things like, does the idea of gun control, since we're talking about it, was there any room to discuss, does gun control really mean you're going to lose your guns? I mean, that's of course the whole argument the NRA makes, and that people say when they talk about the Second Amendment, well, we ought to have the right just to have our guns, and that's all there is to it. But was there any room to say, well, wait a minute, is it really that black and white?
Absolutely. I think one of the best things about being a facilitator, and the longer you do it, is that you start to be able to ask the right question, and you notice that you're working with the group and they stop talking to you, the facilitator, and they start talking to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't always happen, but when it does, it leads to situations in which that did happen in this group. I remember there were two really passionate people, and it was toward the end of the conversation, and they just stood and faced each other. They stood up, and there was people were a little afraid. I was feeling pretty good about it, but she just said, look, I don't want to take your guns, and he said, you want to take my guns? I don't want to take your guns. And I was just about to interrupt, and then there was a pause. M. Scott Peck, one of my favorite thinkers, talks about this, where we're in this sense of chaos. We live in pseudo community most of the time, and then we get this sense of chaos when we realize our differences. And it's only after a period of emptiness that we become a community. And what I watched was this emptiness, this period where no one said anything. And then I think one of them asked the other a question. I don't remember it. I wish I did. But she got a real answer. And then he asked her a question, and she gave him a real answer. This is the trust piece. Mm-hmm. And they did not agree with one another walking out of that room. And meanwhile, everybody else is sort of watching this happen. But I think we all learned something about emptying ourselves of that need to control the situation and be right, and really just get curious and see what's behind this person's thinking.
Yeah, we spend so much time hearing the shallow sound bites and so on, and then we just buy that rather than thinking more about it. Of course, we could talk about Donald Trump. So many people say, I'd vote for him again because I trust him. Uh-huh. And what I always wonder, and I would wonder it about any politician really, is what do you really trust? You hear words, but do you dig down to look at the actions behind the words? Do you look at all the things that they do or not? And unfortunately, we don't tend to allow ourselves, and I think we also don't teach our children nearly enough to be curious.
Right. Yes. Curiosity is so key. And that negative capability of being able, I love this concept of negative capability. Have you heard this? It's a neuroscientific concept where basically
tell us about it.
Well, sorry. You're allowing yourself to realize that you don't have the answer in the moment. Our society is so obsessed with having the right answer, usually a simple answer, right in the moment that something's needed. And unless you're in a true crisis, it's actually really bad to make a decision really fast.
Yeah.
And it's really good to step back and employ this concept of negative capability. You see how long you can wait in that space of unknowing to have an answer. And you'll find that people with a higher negative capability make better decisions because it allows them to consult others, be curious, fill that space in their brains of even what the unknown unknowns. Like, what do I not know? Let's find out what I don't even know that I don't know. And it's that can really bring us way beyond where we're at with our relationships. And I think too, that's one of the strengths of being an autistic person, is that I think a lot of negative capability, because I've spent my entire life sort of going, why did they just do that? What was the assumption behind that? I don't have those simple rules that I think neurotypical culture has. And it's always led me to always take a step back and ask, why did that happen? And get curious. And I love sharing that negative capability with others.
Interesting concept. I wasn't really familiar with it, but the other part about it is you also said the only really good time or the necessary time to make a fast decision is when there's a crisis.
Right.
But I would also add to that making a fast decision in a crisis also comes down to as much preparation ahead of time. So, of course, for me, the example is the World Trade Center and all the things that I did to prepare for an emergency, not necessarily ever expecting one, but at the same time needing to know information. I had a discussion just yesterday with someone who asked me the question about, well, was it or could it be an advantage in a situation like the World Trade Center not to see as opposed to being able to see? And what I pointed out was that you're still basing that question on having eyesight and comparing more or less eyesight. And that's not really the question to ask or the issue to discuss. The issue really is, what do you do to prepare for different situations in your life?
Absolutely.
So for me, going out and exploring, learning what to do in the case of an emergency was something that I felt necessary and required for me to do as the leader of an office.
Uh-huh.
It also prepared me for an emergency, and it gave me information that sighted people would not normally get because they just rely on the signs to tell them what to do and where to go, which only works if you can see the signs and if you have time to read the signs. So it's really not sight versus not sight. It's preparation versus not preparing.
Yes, absolutely. And in the autism community, we talk about the concept of social story. I think it's very similar. A lot of times autistic people are said like, wow, you really know what to do in a crisis, and we can turn off all our feelings and be these heroes in crises. And we may bring that with us in a lot of PTSD. We are much more susceptible to PTSD. But with our neurotypes, but we're really good in a crisis. And I think it's exactly what you were just talking about. When the world, I don't know about you, Michael, but I think when the world is sort of designed for not you.
Yeah,
sure. You have to take that extra step to get curious about your own planning, your own approach to things that the rest of the world takes for granted. And I think that that's a richness that those of us who bring these various lenses can bring into the greater world. Like, hey, have you ever thought about it this way? And they were really, I'm really glad that served you well in that situation.
Well, the other part of that is the world may not be designed with me in mind in some way.
For help.
Preparing and doing what I do, can I help the world become a little bit more designed for more of us than less of us?
I love that.
And the more of us may not be the majority, but can the world be made to be more designed for more of us than less of us?
Absolutely. That's great.
And I think that is an important part of it. It isn't just learning, it's then utilizing that information. And in reality, it is my belief that everyone should learn what to do in an emergency. And very frankly, I would say for most people, learn what to do as a blind person. because you rely way too much on your eyesight much too often, and you don't learn nearly as much as you can learn by utilizing some other skills, which isn't to say don't use your eyes, but don't limit yourself to your eyesight.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. And it forces you to just regard your surroundings differently, I would imagine, too. This reminds me, too, of another of my favorite thinkers, Duncan Green, has this wonderful book, How Change Happens. And he talks about that preparation piece. And he said, working for an NGO, the idea was that if you really wanted to change systems, you would figure out your entire plan for changing something, and you would present the entire plan when the crisis happens. The moment the crisis happens, if you're the first one to plop down the plan for moving out of that crisis, you've just changed the system forever. I love that concept.
And it makes perfect sense. The reality is that we should be doing more of that. We shouldn't just be moving around as robots, which we do way too often.
Absolutely. Yeah. Mechanization and expertise have moved us in that place for sure. Yeah.
So I have a wife who we've now been married almost 40 years. It will be 40 years next month. And I've had to learn what eyesight is all about. And I've learned to explore that and learn what she sees, how other people see. And that helps me be more part of that world. But at the same time, then I can use that to say, okay, but here are the limitations of that. Now take that another step and really look at what if you don't just use your eyes, and what are the advantages of expanding your horizons, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that.
So it's a challenge.
Remember?
So you started your company, and what do you do? What exactly does the company do today?
Well, like I said, we moved from sort of doing strategic planning into more organizational change work, leadership work. And I fell into doing this work around looking at large systems too now, taking that into the city of St. Paul. We did a constituent services study, and we looked at equity implications around who can access constituent service and who can't, and what is the quality of that service, and what's the experience, what's the user journey like, and how can you improve it, and how can you improve the system, looking at all those different more and less predictable ways of working, and looking at all those different ways that people can lead from anywhere in the system and the types of things that they can do. And then I'm hoping to get some new work, knock on wood, where I get to do more of that, but also employ narrative ethnography. I'm very excited about this. Do you remember Cambridge Analytica in 2016?
Yes.
They basically worked through Facebook to try to find the narratives that were shaping the culture and shift them so that they would get what they wanted out of the election. I kind of want to be the good guy and use that technology for good, is be able to trace the narratives that a culture is telling itself and look for narratives that are positive, that would help, emerging narratives that will help lead that organization in the right direction and in the direction of its values, and try to move a system by studying those things. So that's the next horizon for me. And it's a project I've been hoping and planning for the last 5 years. So I'm hoping that I'm really the one that's putting my book down full of steps, and that I'm the first one to do it. I'm not the first by far, but I'm excited to do this new work at a larger scale.
You'll be the first to do it the way you do it.
I suppose. We'll see.
Tell us more about this concept of narratives.
So narratives are the stories we tell ourselves that shape our behavior. They shape our behavior, they shape our emotions, they shape our relationships, our culture on a grander scale, right? And a culture can believe a set of narratives, individuals do. And these can be good or bad. Working with human narratives, the stories we tell ourselves can be good or bad. Like I said, Cambridge Analytica, bad example of something where you can harness what people believe, the predictions that their brains have made about the way the world works, and make them more afraid, make them do things that are more reactive. But you can also find those hopeful narratives in a culture, those narratives that will lead you toward more connection, more care, and amp those up, repeat those, tell those stories, and lead a culture in a different way. And this works for individuals too. There's a lot of different facilitative frameworks where you can work with an individual or a small group to help them kind of shift their image of themselves and move them in a new direction. So it's that level of change work that is really harnessed in this concept of narratives, because our brains literally predict every moment. And if you can help people predict differently, you can help people change.
How do you incorporate mindfulness into the things that you do? And what is mindfulness? How would you define it? That's a broad subject, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's about awareness and curiosity, right? That's about, being as much as you can be in your body, knowing what's happening within your body, knowing what that says for you in your context about how you're feeling about things. What is good for you? What is bad for you? What feels good or bad? I think a lot of us are so caught up in this sort of perfectionist, go culture of, and even in my family of origin, how will you work your way till your next paycheck? You're working more out of competition, fear, sometimes perfectionism. I know that was me before my autism diagnosis. I still struggle with it. But what mindfulness does is it helps you just kind of check in with yourself and be able to read what do I actually need in this moment? What am I actually desiring in this moment? And it's only then, when you can help folks feel that about their own selves, that you can help a group be more mindful of one another, a culture be more mindful of itself.
How do you teach people to do that?
Playfully. I used to be a theater teacher, so there's a lot of improv involved, sometimes in a more playful sense. With more serious groups, it's just about inviting people to close their eyes and check in with their bodies. If we're virtual, I'll say, feel free to turn off your camera. We're just going to take a few breaths. Taking pauses when a group would normally speed ahead. You remember what I said about emptiness, right?
Yeah.
We need to be able to take those moments of silence, emptiness, to check in with ourselves, to see where we're really at. And, brainstorming works much better when you can take some time of pause, take a break, go on a walk, come back. There's that negative capability thing again. Pausing before deciding, pausing before gathering, pausing to consider. Those are all things that I would consider to be mindfulness. And there are exercises to do that. Certainly I taught yoga for a while, and I could do that with certain groups. For the most part, it's much simpler than that. It's about just pausing.
It's also about giving yourself permission and hopefully encouraging yourself and changing your habits and mindset to doing it. Yeah. Because so often we just hear excuses. Oh, I don't have time to do that.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be meditation. Meditation doesn't actually work for everyone. And it works for me. I love it. But I know a lot of folks who really struggle with it, particularly in the ADD community. But I think it's just about taking time. And for some people, that might be taking a walk. For some people, it might be spinning something in their hand. For some people, it's sitting and breathing and feeling the weight of gravity, right? But whatever it is, I try to help people find that. Yeah.
So when you say meditation, what do you mean by that?
That's a highly cultural concept, right? It's different across cultures. For me, I think of the sort of the desert fathers in Christianity and just sort of being silent and sitting in the presence of God, Others would say it's about being silent and just sitting in the presence of nature, or whatever it is, or checking in with our chakras, or whatever it is. Different cultures have different definitions for what it means, but it's about taking time. And, we know that some folks believe that meditation is only just sort of freeing your mind and not thinking about anything. But I think what I've noticed as a pattern, at least in my own small way, is that so much of it is about self-compassion. It's like no one starts out being able to meditate perfectly, but a lot of us can benefit from it if we have self-compassion and just, keep trying to just...
Right. And of course, the whole idea of meditation, sure, is being silent and possibly emptying your mind. But the whole idea behind mindfulness, in a sense, is meditation. It's taking time to not just go forward and confront the day. And it doesn't really matter how you do it, but you do need to take time mentally for yourself or to slow down.
Absolutely.
And I think that's as much a concept of meditation as is anything else.
Absolutely.
I mean, then there's always transcendental meditation where you say a mantra, and that can be very helpful to people who do it. And it may help more people than think that they could do it, but still, it's all about taking time to slow down and disconnecting from just what goes on in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Or really just noticing more, right? Taking in more with more of your senses, what is actually happening.
Yeah.
Because that predictive brain of ours, we actually don't see, we don't hear, we don't taste, we don't smell, we don't touch most things in the moment. We've already predicted those things. And we only really sense what we predicted we would sense. We actually have to slow ourselves down to truly sense what's happening around us.
So what's next for you?
Well, I had this project that hopefully I'll get to do some narrative ethnography and what we call sense making. I've got a course coming up on adaptive leadership on December 3rd. Sign up for that at my website, cultivatestrategy.com/events. Be teaching my 2-day technology participation facilitation course if you want to learn about how to facilitate and collaborate better. I teach that about once a quarter, either in Seattle or online. Hopefully we'll start to teach that in Minnesota too. And someday, you had asked me about this earlier, Michael, before the show. I am hoping to complete my musical about growing up as an autistic kid and trying to fit in. So working on that too.
There you go. Are you going to write the lyrics? Are you going to write the songs? Or are you going to write the words around them and let somebody else come in and do it?
It's going to be, I think it's going to be a jukebox musical. So it'll be just hits from the 80s and 90s. Moving through my own experience of middle and early high school with the dialogue that I write. Yeah.
Have you thought about taking a lot of the content of your courses and putting them into a book and using that as another mechanism to teach?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of existing books, particularly on the technology of participation. I do write blogs pretty regularly, and I've started to do some video logs as well on TikTok and Facebook. But someday I might start to gather some of that stuff together and make a compendium or something that makes sense. But I'm a little too random, maybe, to make that full nonfiction book for reality.
Oh, there you go.
I'm always finding something new to talk about and work on and synthesize.
Well, and that's valuable. And as you said, so your courses will be online as well, and they are online?
Yeah, the Deciding How to Decide is online, and there's both an in-person and online version of that top facilitation methods, which is actually through toptraining.net. You can sign up for courses in that all over, even the world.
Toptraining.net is
Toptraining.net is the U.S. arm of the Institute for Cultural Affairs. Is the purveyor of that particular band of training.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, so you've sort of said it, but if people want to reach out to you and maybe learn more about you and talk with you, and do you do individual coaching?
I do. Yeah.
So how do they reach out to you and learn about all of that?
There is a website. There's a form on my website, cultivatestrategy.com. And you can also just email me at sherry@cultivatestrategy.com, SHERRY. I'm happy to respond. And
strategy singular, just to make sure everybody understands.
Yes.
Well, Sherry, this has been fun.
Yeah.
And I've enjoyed it. I really appreciate you coming on. And my dog has stayed awake over here, so he must be happy with it. There you go.
That's awesome.
Alamo pays attention to everything I do. I can't get away with anything. We do have the door closed so the cat doesn't get to come in. And I understand you like cats.
I adore cats. I have 2 of them, including the best cat in the world named Kesnick.
We have a cat we rescued 7.5 years ago. We thought we were just going to find her a home. And then I learned that the cat's name was Stitch. And my wife is a quilter. Do you think that cat was going to go anywhere?
No. It adopted you.
Oh, it took over us. Yeah. She's a great cat. And she and Alamo get along very well. So we're happy with that.
That's great.
Well, thanks again for being here. And I want to thank you for listening. And wherever you are, please give us a 5-star rating. We appreciate it. That's another thing, Sherry. You could do a podcast.
Oh goodness, I've done something like it. We'll see someday.
but wherever you are, please give us a 5-star rating. I'd love to hear from you. Please reach out to me at michaelhi@accessibe, ACCESSIBE.com. And Sherry, we'll have to talk about your website and see how accessible it is.
Oh, I'm working on it. It's not there yet.
Well, check out Accessibe. It can help, and it's not expensive. It's a way to really help, and I'll be glad to help you with that. But we hope that wherever you are, you'll give us a rating and you'll reach out. Love to hear your thoughts. And we'll be back, of course, again very soon with another episode of Unstoppable Mindset, where inclusion, diversity, and my favorite part, the unexpected meet. And again, Sherry, thank you for being a part of this.
Thank you for having me, Michael. This was fun.